Before we begin, I need you to understand something. This isn't a story about getting stoned. This is the story of the plant that conquered the American frontier, the same plant that roped cattle, built railroads, healed gunshot wounds, and made every covered wagon possible, before a conspiracy of racism and greed erased it from history. If you're ready to discover the truth they buried, like and subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Distractions away, let's ride. In the beginning, before America, before Europe as we know it, before the great empires of Rome and Greece and Persia, before writing itself had been invented, there was a plant. It grew wild on the windswept steppes of Central Asia, somewhere in the vast grasslands between what we now call Mongolia and the Tibetan Plateau. Its stalks were tall and fibrous, its leaves were serrated and distinctive, its seeds were small, oily and nutritious, and for reasons we can only partially reconstruct from fragments of bone and ash and preserved fiber, the earliest humans who encountered this plant recognized something valuable in it. 10,000 years. That is the conservative estimate archaeologists now give for the relationship between humanity and cannabis. 10,000 years of cultivation, of deliberate planting and harvesting, of saving seeds and improving strains, of building entire technologies around a single, remarkable plant. To put that number in perspective, the Egyptian pyramids are less than 5,000 years old. The first cities of Mesopotamia arose roughly 6,000 years ago. When those ancient Sumerians were just beginning to scratch their first symbols into clay tablets, humans had already been growing cannabis for 4,000 years. This is a relationship that predates civilization itself. And here is what we must understand from the outset, what we must carry with us through everything that follows. This relationship was not born of intoxication. It was not about getting high. It was about survival. The Neolithic peoples who first cultivated cannabis on those Central Asian steppes were practical people facing practical problems. They needed rope to bind shelters and snare game. They needed fiber to weave into cloth that could protect their bodies from bitter winters. They needed oil for their lamps and nutrition for their children. Cannabis provided all of these things with a reliability and versatility that few other plants could match. The fibers of the hemp plant, stripped from the stalk, dried in the sun, and twisted into cordage, were among the strongest natural materials available to ancient peoples. Hemp rope could bear enormous weight without snapping. Hemp cloth could withstand years of hard use without rotting. In an age when every resource had to be maximized, when survival meant constant ingenuity, hemp was indispensable. It was not a luxury. It was a necessity, and so it spread, carried along the ancient trade routes planted by migrating peoples until it had colonized nearly every corner of the inhabited world. By 8,000 years before the Common Era, hemp cultivation had become established across vast stretches of Asia, but nowhere did it find a more complete integration into human society than in ancient China. There, cannabis became one of the wugu, the 5 sacred grains that formed the foundation of Chinese agriculture and civilization. This is remarkable because cannabis is not technically a grain at all, yet the Chinese classified it alongside rice, wheat, millet, and soybeans as one of the essential crops, the pillars upon which their entire way of life was built. They used every part of the plant. The seeds were pressed for oil, a nutritious food source rich in protein and essential fatty acids. The fibers became clothing for peasants and emperors alike. And in what may be the most consequential innovation in human history, the Chinese discovered that hemp fibers could be processed into paper. The oldest known fragments of paper, dating to the 2nd century before the Common Era, were made from hemp. Consider what this means. Before parchment, before papyrus became widespread, before the printing press, there was hemp paper carrying the accumulated wisdom of Chinese civilization across generations, the bureaucratic records of dynasties, the poetry of scholars, the medical knowledge of healers, all of it preserved on sheets made from a plant that would one day be classified as having no accepted use whatsoever. The medical use of cannabis in China stretches back to the mists of legend. According to tradition, the Emperor Shen Nung, considered the father of Chinese agriculture and medicine, compiled a pharmacopoeia around 2737 BCE that listed cannabis as a remedy for a remarkable range of ailments: gout, rheumatism, malaria, absent-mindedness, female disorders. Whether Shen Nung was a historical figure or a mythologized cultural hero remains debated. But what the legend tells us is how deeply embedded cannabis had become in Chinese medical thinking. This was not fringe medicine. This was part of the foundational canon that would influence Asian healing traditions for millennia. But it was not only in China that cannabis found its way into the sacred and the ceremonial. Far to the west, on the great grassland steppes that stretched from the Black Sea to the borders of the Chinese heartland, a different people had discovered a different use for this versatile plant. The Scythians were nomadic horsemen, fierce warriors whose mounted archers terrorized settled civilizations for centuries. They left no written records of their own, but the Greek historian Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, described their customs with the careful precision of an anthropologist. After a burial, Herodotus wrote, the Scythians would purify themselves in a manner that astonished the Greeks. They would construct small tents from wooden poles and woolen felt, sealing them tight against the outside air. Inside they would place a dish of red-hot stones. Then they would take the seeds of the cannabis plant and throw them onto the heated stones. The tent would fill with thick, aromatic smoke, and the Scythians within would inhale deeply, howling with pleasure as the vapours enveloped them. It was a funeral rite, a ritual of mourning and release, a way to touch the spirit world and honour the dead. For centuries, scholars debated whether Herodotus had accurately described what he claimed to have witnessed. Some dismissed it as Greek fantasy, an Orientalist projection onto barbarian peoples. But then, in the frozen tombs of Siberia, archaeologists began to find evidence. The Pazyryk burials, preserved for over 2,000 years in permafrost, contained exactly what Herodotus had described: bronze vessels that had held heated stones, the carbonized remains of cannabis seeds, and the skeletal remains of the Scythians who had used them. The vapor tents were real. The ritual was real. 2,500 years after Herodotus wrote his account, the ice gave up its confirmation. This was not recreational use in any modern sense. It was sacrament. It was a technology of transcendence, a way for a people who lived their entire lives on horseback under the vast sky to commune with something greater than themselves. The Scythians did not separate the practical from the spiritual the way modern societies attempt to do. The same plant that provided their rope and their clothing also provided their gateway to the divine. As the trade routes of the ancient world expanded, as caravans moved along what would later be called the Silk Road, cannabis travelled with them. It arrived in India, and there it found what may be its deepest spiritual home. In the Hindu tradition, cannabis became intertwined with Shiva, the god of destruction and transformation, the ascetic deity who sits in meditation on the frozen peaks of the Himalayas. Legend held that Shiva himself consumed bhang, a drink made from ground cannabis leaves mixed with milk, honey, and aromatic spices. To consume bhang was to share in the god's consciousness, to touch the cosmic awareness that Shiva embodied. Bhang became woven into the religious and cultural fabric of the Indian subcontinent. It was consumed during festivals, particularly Holi, the vibrant celebration of spring and colour that still draws millions of participants today. It was the preferred intoxicant of sadhus and holy men, of yogis seeking enlightenment through meditation and austerity. Cannabis in its various forms, bhang, ganja, karas, became part of a spiritual tradition stretching back thousands of years, a tradition that continues unbroken to this day. In India, bhang remains legal, sold openly at government-licensed shops, consumed without stigma as it has been for millennia. From India, Cannabis spread further to the Middle East, to Africa, to every corner of the ancient world touched by trade and migration. But in Europe, something different happened. The Greeks and Romans certainly knew of cannabis. They used hemp extensively for rope and textiles, understanding its industrial value as well as any civilization before or since. Yet the psychoactive properties of the plant, the possibility of smoking or ingesting it for its mind-altering effects, did not take root in European culture. Not yet. For the peoples of the Mediterranean and Northern Europe, cannabis remained a crop, not a sacrament. It was useful, not mystical. The climate was less conducive to the development of high-potency strains. The cultural and religious frameworks did not embrace intoxicants the way some Eastern traditions did. Wine was the European drug of choice, and wine it would remain. And so, for millennia, this was the equilibrium. Cannabis existed in dozens of forms across dozens of cultures, each using it according to their needs and beliefs. It was medicine in China, rope in Rome, a sacred intoxicant in India, a mourning ritual among the Scythians. It clothed bodies and fed families and healed the sick and transported the faithful to other realms of consciousness. It was ubiquitous and unremarkable, part of the landscape of human agriculture since before anyone thought to write down what they were doing. No one feared it. No one demonized it. It was simply a plant, and like all plants, it served. But this plant, ancient and patient and infinitely adaptable, had not yet completed its greatest journey. The steppes of Mongolia were only the beginning. The silk routes of Asia were only the middle chapters. The real story, the story that would transform this humble crop into the most controversial substance on Earth, was still waiting in a land that did not yet exist, on a continent that the peoples of Asia and Europe had not yet discovered, waiting for a new world and a new chapter, and a transformation so complete that even those who had cultivated it for 10,000 years would not recognize what it would become. The plant that had sustained humanity since the Neolithic age was about to cross an ocean, and on the other side of that ocean, it would help build an empire. The age of European exploration was, above all else, the age of sail. The great powers of the 15th, 16th and 17th centuries, Spain, Portugal, England, France, the Netherlands, measured their strength not in armies alone, but in navies. Fleets of wooden ships crossed oceans, established colonies, extracted wealth from distant lands, and projected power across the globe. And every single one of those ships, from the smallest fishing vessel to the mightiest warship of the line, depended absolutely and completely on one material for its operation: hemp. Consider the numbers. A single large warship, the kind that would form the backbone of a European battle fleet, required between 50 and 60 tons of hemp for its initial construction. 50 tons. Every rope on the vessel, from the thickest anchor cable to the thinnest signal line, was made from hemp fiber. Every sail was woven from hemp canvas, the word itself derived from cannabis. The caulking that sealed the planks against the sea contained hemp oakum. The rigging that allowed sailors to control those massive sails, to harness the wind and move thousands of tons of wood and iron across the water, was hemp rope. A single ship might carry over 60 miles of hemp rope in its rigging alone. And that rope wore out, needed replacement, required a constant supply chain stretching back across oceans to the fields where hemp was grown. Without hemp, there would have been no age of sail. Without hemp, there would have been no European empires. Without hemp, the modern world as we know it could not have come into existence. This was not a matter of preference or tradition. This was strategic necessity. Hemp rope was stronger, more durable, and more resistant to saltwater rot than any alternative. Naval planners understood that their nation's security depended on a reliable supply of this critical material. A great power that could not outfit its fleet with hemp was a great power that would soon cease to be great. Wars were fought over hemp-producing regions. Trade agreements were negotiated with hemp supplies as a central concern. The Baltic states, particularly Russia, controlled much of Europe's hemp supply, and this gave them enormous leverage in international affairs. The great powers of Europe looked at hemp the way modern nations look at oil, as a resource so essential that access to it was worth any price, any alliance, any war. And so when European colonizers crossed the Atlantic and began to establish permanent settlements in the New World, one of the very first things they did was plant hemp. This was not a casual decision, it was imperial policy. In 1606, a French botanist named Louis Hebert planted the first hemp crop in North America, in what is now Nova Scotia. The English colonists followed within years, and almost immediately the colonial authorities made clear that hemp cultivation was not merely encouraged, it was required. In 1619, the Virginia Colonial Assembly passed one of the first agricultural laws in American history. The law was simple and direct. Every farmer in the colony was required to grow hemp, not permitted, not encouraged, required, mandated by law, with penalties for those who failed to comply. The language of the statute left no room for interpretation. Colonists must provide seeds and land and labor to cultivate this essential crop or face the consequences. The same requirement was soon enacted in Massachusetts, in Connecticut, in Maryland, in the other colonies that were spreading along the Atlantic seaboard. Colonial governors understood what their masters in London understood. Without hemp, the colonial enterprise would fail. Ships needed to be built and maintained. Rope needed to be manufactured. The new settlements needed to be self-sufficient in this most critical of materials. The Crown could not afford to ship tons of hemp across the Atlantic when it could be grown on American soil. Let that sink in for a moment. The same plant that today results in arrest and imprisonment that is classified by the United States federal government as a Schedule I controlled substance with no accepted medical use was once required by American law to be cultivated. Failure to grow it could result in fines. In some colonies, failure to grow it could result in jail. The irony is so complete, so absolute, that it borders on the absurd. The founding generation of American colonists were not just permitted to grow cannabis, they were compelled to do so by the weight of colonial law. Today, a person can spend years in prison for possessing a substance that their nation once mandated they produce. This is not ancient history from some distant civilization with different values. This is American history, the history of the same land governed by the same constitution, separated from us by a mere handful of generations. As the colonies matured and prospered, as they developed their own distinct American character, hemp remained central to their economy and identity. And nowhere is this more evident than in the lives and writings of the men we now call the Founding Fathers. These were not marginal figures experimenting with an exotic crop. These were the architects of American independence, the authors of the Declaration and the Constitution, the first presidents and statesmen of the new republic, and they were, almost to a man, hemp farmers. George Washington grew hemp at Mount Vernon, his beloved Virginia estate, for more than 30 years. His farming diaries, meticulously preserved in the Library of Congress, contain numerous references to his hemp cultivation. He tracked planting dates and harvest yields. With the precision of a man who understood the economic importance of every acre, he experimented with different varieties and growing techniques. He complained when the harvest was poor and celebrated when it was abundant. He corresponded with other farmers about the best methods for processing hemp fiber, always seeking improvements, always looking to maximize the value of his crop. In one diary entry from August 1765, Washington wrote of his intention to separate the male and female hemp plants, noting that he had sowed hemp at Muddy Hole by Swamp and begun to separate the male from the female hemp rather too late. This practice of separating male and female plants would be familiar to any modern cannabis cultivator concerned with maximizing the potency of female flowers. Whether Washington had any interest in the psychoactive properties of his crop remains unknown and probably unknowable. What is certain is that he considered hemp cultivation a matter of considerable importance to his farming operations and to the young nation he would one day lead. Thomas Jefferson was equally devoted to the plant. At Monticello, his Virginia plantation, Jefferson grew hemp throughout his life. He invented a device for processing hemp fiber more efficiently, a break that could separate the valuable fibers from the woody core of the stalk, saving hours of back-breaking labor. Jefferson was a scientist and innovator in all things agricultural, and hemp was one of his particular interests. He smuggled hemp seeds out of China, risking severe penalties from the Chinese authorities who guarded their agricultural secrets jealously because he believed that certain Chinese varieties produced superior fiber. He corresponded extensively with other agricultural reformers about hemp cultivation techniques. He believed that American hemp could compete with the finest varieties from anywhere in the world, and he devoted considerable effort to proving it. In his farm journal, Jefferson recorded hemp harvests alongside tobacco and wheat, treating it as what it was, a staple crop essential to the plantation economy. Benjamin Franklin, that most versatile of the founders, owned and operated a paper mill that processed hemp into the pages on which colonial ideas would be printed and spread. The pamphlets that stirred revolutionary sentiment, the newspapers that kept colonists informed of British tyranny, the broadsides that rallied support for independence. Many of these were printed on paper made from hemp fiber processed in mills like Franklin's. The revolutionary generation did not merely tolerate hemp, they built their instruments of communication and persuasion from it. And then there is the Declaration of Independence itself. The final official version of that sacred document was inscribed on parchment, animal skin prepared for writing. But the earlier drafts, the working copies on which Jefferson composed his immortal phrases, and the Continental Congress debated every word, were written on paper, hemp paper, the self-evident truths that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These words were first committed to hemp. The founding document of American democracy was drafted on the fibers of a plant now classified as having no legitimate use. Hemp was so valuable in colonial and early America that it served in some places and times as a form of currency. Several colonies, including Virginia and Maryland, allowed farmers to pay their taxes in hemp when hard currency was unavailable. When specie was scarce, as it often was on the frontier where banks were distant and coinage rare, hemp could be exchanged for goods and services at established rates. Merchants accepted it. Creditors accepted it. The colonial governments accepted it in payment of obligations. It was in the most literal sense as good as gold. The wealth of nations, the stability of currencies, the very foundations of economic life in early America all rested in part on the cultivation and trade of cannabis. A farmer with a good hemp harvest was a wealthy man, regardless of how much silver he had in his strongbox. Now, it is important here to establish a distinction that will become crucial as our story unfolds. The hemp grown by Washington and Jefferson and the colonial farmers of Virginia was not the same, in practical terms, as the marijuana that would later be smoked in jazz clubs and hippie communes. Cannabis is a single species, but it encompasses an enormous range of varieties bred over thousands of years for different purposes. The industrial hemp cultivated for fiber was tall, stalky, and contained very little tetrahydrocannabinol, the psychoactive compound responsible for the marijuana high. You could smoke an entire field of colonial hemp and achieve nothing but a headache and sore lungs. The cannabis varieties bred for their intoxicating properties, what we now call marijuana, were different plants entirely, shorter, bushier, with resinous flowers rich in THC. These varieties had been cultivated for centuries in warmer climates, in India and the Middle East and parts of Africa, where the psychoactive properties were valued for spiritual and recreational use. The founding fathers, as far as we know, had no experience with these high-potency varieties. Their hemp was industrial hemp, a fiber crop as mundane and essential as cotton or flax. But here is the bitter irony that sits at the heart of American cannabis history. When the Prohibition came, when the laws were written and the arrests began, this distinction was deliberately, systematically erased. The plant that Washington grew and Jefferson championed was lumped together with the plant smoked in Mexican border towns and Harlem jazz clubs. Industrial hemp, which had built the American Navy and clothed American soldiers and made American paper, was banned alongside marijuana, despite having no more psychoactive potential than a cornstalk. The baby was thrown out with the bathwater, and an entire American agricultural tradition was criminalized overnight. But that prohibition was still more than a century away when the young American Republic began its great expansion westward. The revolution had been won. The Constitution had been ratified. The new nation stretched from the Atlantic coast to the Mississippi River, and already there were those who dreamed of pushing further, of claiming the vast interior of the continent for American settlement and American values. In Kentucky, which had become a state in 1792, hemp cultivation exploded into a major industry. The bluegrass region proved ideal for growing fiber hemp, and Kentucky farmers rushed to meet the Navy's insatiable demand. By the mid-19th century, Kentucky would be producing nearly all of the hemp used in American rope and cordage, with thousands of acres under cultivation and entire towns built around hemp processing. The frontier was calling, and Americans were answering. As the nation pushed westward, hemp went with it. The covered wagons that carried settlers across the Great Plains were covered in hemp canvas, that distinctive white bonnet that has become synonymous with pioneer America. The ropes that bound their supplies, that controlled their draft animals, that raised and lowered their loads over mountains and across rivers, were hemp rope. The clothing on their backs was often hemp cloth, durable enough to withstand months of hard travel. The medicine in their trunks, for treating everything from toothaches to snake bites to the agonies of childbirth, frequently contained cannabis extracts purchased from pharmacies back east. The frontier was no place for the faint of heart, and hemp in all its forms was an essential companion for those brave or desperate enough to venture into the unknown. Every wagon train that set out from St. Louis or Independence, every family that packed their lives into a wooden box on wheels and pointed it toward California or Oregon, carried hemp with them as surely as they carried flour and ammunition. The story of hemp in America was about to enter its most dramatic chapter, not in the halls of Congress or the plantations of Virginia, but in the vast, wild, untamed spaces of the American West. In the cattle towns and mining camps, on the railroad tracks and in the army forts, wherever Americans pushed the boundaries of their expanding nation, hemp was there. This was not a story of founding fathers and constitutional debates. This was a story of cowboys and outlaws, of prospectors and pioneers, of ordinary people doing extraordinary things in a land that offered both unlimited promise and constant danger. But this is not a story about the East Coast elite, about wealthy planters and their political philosophies. This is a story about the frontier, about the men and women who risked everything to build a new life in a new land, about the tools and technologies they carried with them, and the plants that made their survival possible. The hemp that Washington grew in Virginia was about to become the hemp that built the Wild West. And that is a story that has never properly been told until now. Picture it. The year is 1848, and you are standing at the edge of the Missouri River in Independence, Missouri. Before you stretches a sea of white-topped wagons, hundreds of them, perhaps thousands, all pointed west toward the promise of gold in California or fertile land in Oregon. The air smells of wood smoke and animal sweat and the particular dusty sweetness of the prairie. Families are making their final preparations, checking and rechecking their supplies, saying goodbye to everything they have ever known. They are about to embark on a journey of 2,000 miles across some of the most unforgiving terrain on Earth. Many of them will not survive. but those white tops bobbing on the prairie like sails on a landlocked sea, those iconic covered wagons that have come to symbolize the entire American frontier experience, what are they made of? Hemp. Every single one of them. Hemp canvas stretched over wooden bows, waterproofed with linseed oil, strong enough to withstand months of brutal sun and driving rain, and the constant abrasion of trail dust. The word canvas itself comes from cannabis, a linguistic fossil preserving the ancient connection between the plant and the cloth. Those wagon covers were not made of cotton, which was too delicate and prone to rot in the wet conditions of river crossings and prairie storms. They were not made of wool, which was too heavy and too expensive and would have added dangerous weight to already overburdened wagons. They were made of hemp, the same material that had covered the sails of Columbus's ships, the same material that had clothed Roman legions, the same material that human beings had been weaving for 10,000 years. A good hemp canvas cover would last the entire journey, protecting families and their possessions from rain and sun and the ever-present dust of the trail. And it was not just the canvas. Look closer at those wagons preparing to depart, the ropes that lash down the cargo, that secure the water barrels, that tie the spare oxen to the back of the wagon. What are they made of? Hemp rope. The harnesses that connect the draft animals to the wagon tongue, the traces and lines that allow the driver to control beasts weighing 1,000 pounds each. What are they made of? Hemp rope. The caulking that seals the wagon bed, transforming it into a makeshift boat for river crossings. What does it contain? Hemp fibre, pounded and tarred into oakum from the moment the first wheel turned until the last wagon creaked into its destination months later. Hemp was there. Hemp rope. Again and again, hemp rope. The Oregon Trail, the California Trail, the Santa Fe Trail, all the great overland routes that carried American civilization from the Mississippi to the Pacific were hemp highways. The infrastructure of westward expansion was built from cannabis fiber. Without it, the wagons would have fallen apart before they reached the Rockies. Without it, the animals could not have been controlled. Without it, the rivers could not have been crossed. The great migration that populated the American West, that transformed a continental nation from a dream into a reality, depended absolutely on a plant that would one day be classified as having no legitimate use whatsoever. Now picture a different scene. The sun is setting over the Texas plains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. A cowboy sits by a dying campfire, the day's work finally done. His muscles ache from 12 hours in the saddle. Tomorrow he will do it again, and the day after, and the day after that, pushing 3,000 head of longhorn cattle north toward the railheads in Kansas. It is brutal, dangerous work, and the men who do it have become legends. But look at what the cowboy holds in his calloused hands as the light fades. He is coiling his lariat, inspecting it for frays and weak spots, because his life depends on this rope. A rope that breaks at the wrong moment means a lost steer at best, a trampling death at worst. What is his lariat made of? Hemp. The iconic lasso of the American cowboy, that spinning loop that has become synonymous with the western frontier, was made from hemp rope. Some cowboys preferred rawhide lariats, braided from strips of untanned cattle hide, but hemp was cheaper, more readily available, and in many ways more reliable. It did not stretch when wet the way rawhide did. It did not require the hours of careful braiding that a good rawhide reator demanded. A working cowboy could buy a ready-made hemp lariat at any general store from Texas to Montana and trust it to hold when he dropped a loop over a running steer. The tools of the cowboy trade were hemp tools. The rope that tied a calf's legs together for branding was hemp. The rope that stretched between posts to form a makeshift corral was hemp. The rope that hung the lantern from the chuck wagon, that secured the bedrolls, that tied the remuda horses together at night, all of it was hemp. the great cattle drives that moved millions of animals from Texas to the northern railheads between the 1860s and the 1880s were held together quite literally by cannabis fiber. Every ranch hand who ever rode for the brand carried hemp rope on his saddle. Every cowboy who ever pulled a drowning steer from a river or roped a wild mustang on the open range did it with hemp in his hands. But the cattle drives were just one part of the great transformation that was remaking the American West. Even as the cowboys pushed their herds north, another force was reshaping the landscape with even greater permanence. The railroads were coming, and they were coming fast. The dream of a transcontinental railroad, a ribbon of iron connecting the Atlantic to the Pacific, had consumed American ambition for decades. After the Civil War, that dream became reality. The Union Pacific pushed west from Omaha. The Central Pacific pushed east from Sacramento. In 1869, they met at Promontory Summit in Utah, and a golden spike was driven to mark the completion of the greatest engineering project the nation had ever undertaken. The construction of the Transcontinental Railroad was a monumental feat of human labor. Thousands of workers, many of them Chinese immigrants on the Central Pacific and Irish immigrants on the Union Pacific, drove spikes and laid ties and moved mountains of earth in conditions that would be considered inhumane by any modern standard. They worked in blistering heat and freezing cold. They blasted tunnels through solid granite. They built bridges over chasms that seemed bottomless, and the ropes that hauled their equipment, that lifted their supplies, that lowered men into the depths and raised them back up again were hemp ropes. The pulleys and tackles that moved the heavy iron rails into position ran on hemp. The guy lines that stabilized the derricks and cranes were hemp rope, the thread that stitched a continent together. The Chinese workers who built the Central Pacific through the Sierra Nevada brought with them their own cultural traditions, including, in all probability, familiarity with cannabis as a medicinal plant. Cannabis had been part of Chinese medicine for thousands of years, and it seems unlikely that these workers, far from home and subjected to constant physical punishment, would have entirely abandoned the healing traditions of their ancestors. The historical record is sparse on this point, as it is sparse on so many aspects of the Chinese railroad workers' experience. They were not considered worthy of documentation by the white Americans who employed them, but the plant that their ancestors had cultivated since before the pyramids was all around them in the ropes they handled every day. The railroads opened the West, but it was gold and silver that drew people there. The mining camps that sprang up across the mountains of California, Nevada, Colorado, and Montana were rough, lawless, dangerous places. Men died in cave-ins and explosions. They died of exposure and disease. They killed each other over claims and card games and insults too trivial to remember. But those who survived could become rich beyond their wildest dreams. The lure was irresistible, and tens of thousands answered it. Now, picture yourself descending into one of those mines. The shaft drops straight down into the earth, hundreds of feet of darkness lit only by flickering candles. The air is thick with dust and the smell of black powder. Water drips from the walls and the timbers groan with the weight of the mountain pressing down. You are lowered into this underworld in a bucket or a cage, suspended from a rope that runs over a pulley at the surface. Your life depends entirely on that rope holding. If it breaks, you fall to your death in the blackness below. What is that rope made of? Hemp. The hoisting ropes that raised and lowered men and ore in the mining camps of the American West were made from hemp. The ropes that operated the pumps that kept the mines from flooding, that ventilated the shafts to prevent suffocation, that moved the heavy machinery required to process ore, all hemp. Wire rope was beginning to appear in some operations by the 1860s and would eventually replace hemp in the deepest mines where the greatest weights were moved. But for decades, the lives of thousands of miners depended every day on the strength and reliability of hemp fiber. Every morning they descended into the earth, trusting hemp to bring them back up. Every evening they returned to the surface because hemp held. The same plant that the government would later declare too dangerous to exist, was literally the lifeline of the Western mining industry, the slender thread connecting thousands of men to the world above. The mining towns that grew up around these operations, Virginia City, Leadville, Tombstone, Deadwood, Cripple Creek, were voracious consumers of hemp products. The general stores that supplied the miners stocked hemp rope by the coil, knowing that it would sell as fast as they could get it. The saloons and hotels were furnished with hemp carpets and hemp curtains. The tents that housed new arrivals until permanent buildings could be constructed were made of hemp canvas, the same material that had brought them west in their wagons. The assay offices and banks where miners brought their gold and silver were protected by hemp-reinforced doors and shutters. The entire material culture of the mining frontier was saturated with cannabis fiber, so ubiquitous that no one thought to remark upon it, so essential that the camps could not have functioned without it. The civilian frontier was wild, but it was not undefended. The United States Army maintained a network of forts and outposts across the West, charged with protecting settlers, guarding transportation routes, and subduing the Native American nations who resisted the invasion of their homelands. These military posts were lifelines of order in a chaotic landscape, and they depended on supply trains that stretched back thousands of miles to the arsenals and quartermaster depots of the East. What did those supply trains carry? Weapons, certainly, ammunition, uniforms, food, but also, in enormous quantities, hemp. The army needed rope for everything, for picketing horses, for raising flags, for securing tents, for operating artillery, for 1,000 different tasks that kept a military post functioning. The wagon trains that supplied the frontier forts were themselves held together with hemp rope, their cargoes lashed down against the jolting of unimproved roads. The mule teams that packed supplies into the most remote outposts were controlled with hemp harnesses. The very flags that flew over Fort Laramie and Fort Apache and Fort Bridger snapped in the wind from hemp halyards. The soldiers who garrisoned these posts lived hard lives in harsh conditions. They suffered from heat and cold, from bad food and worse water, from boredom and loneliness and the ever-present danger of combat. And when they fell ill or were wounded, the medicines available to them frequently contained cannabis. The Army Medical Corps stocked cannabis tinctures and extracts as standard items in their pharmacopoeia. A soldier shot through with an arrow or laid low by dysentery might well receive a dose of cannabis as part of his treatment. The plant served the military frontier in war and in peace, in health and in sickness. But perhaps no single product better illustrates the centrality of hemp to the frontier experience than the humble blue jean. In 1853, a Bavarian immigrant named Levi Strauss arrived in San Francisco, hoping to make his fortune supplying the gold rush miners with dry goods. He brought with him bolts of heavy canvas, intending to sell it for tents and wagon covers. But he quickly realized that the miners had a more pressing need. Their pants were falling apart. The work of mining was brutal on clothing. Men crawled through tunnels, knelt in mud, shoveled rock, and handled abrasive equipment all day long. Ordinary trousers lasted weeks at best. Strauss saw an opportunity and seized it. He began making work pants from his heavy canvas, reinforced at the stress points with copper rivets, an innovation suggested by a tailor named Jacob Davis. These pants were extraordinarily durable, capable of surviving the punishing conditions of the mining camps. They became known as Levi's, and they would eventually become one of the most iconic garments in American history. That original canvas that Strauss used was hemp canvas, the same material that covered the wagons, the same material that had made sails and tents for millennia. Later, Strauss would switch to a cotton-based fabric called denim, a sturdy twill that came originally from the French city of Nimes, hence de Nimes, hence denim. This denim was softer and more comfortable against the skin, better suited for all-day wear, but the original Levi's, the pants that clothed the first generation of frontier workers in the 1850s and 1860s, were made from hemp canvas. The blue jean, that universal symbol of American ruggedness and authenticity, the garment that would be adopted by everyone from factory workers to movie stars to presidents, began its life as a cannabis product. The same plant that would later be associated with counterculture rebellion and social deviance was first worn by the most conservative, hard-working people on the frontier, men who wanted nothing more than durable pants that would survive an honest day's labor in the mines. But hemp fiber was only half the story. While hemp rope held the frontier together, cannabis medicine was keeping its people alive. In the general stores and pharmacies of every western town, alongside the pickaxes and shovels and bolts of calico, you would find rows of small glass bottles containing preparations that listed cannabis as a primary ingredient. These were not underground products sold in back alleys. These were mainstream medicines, manufactured by reputable pharmaceutical companies, advertised in respectable newspapers, and purchased by ordinary Americans for ordinary ailments. Piso's cure for consumption contained cannabis, promising relief for those suffering from tuberculosis and other respiratory conditions that plagued the dusty frontier. One day, Cough Cure listed cannabis among its ingredients. Chlorodyne, a popular remedy for pain and diarrhea that was especially valued in regions with unsafe water supplies, combined cannabis with chloroform and morphine in a powerful concoction that was considered entirely appropriate for home use. Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, marketed for teething babies and colicky infants, contained cannabis along with morphine, a combination that would be unthinkable today but was perfectly normal in the 19th century. Dr. Brown's sedative tablets promised relief from nervous conditions with a formula that prominently featured cannabis extract. Grimal's Indian cigarettes offered cannabis smoke as a treatment for asthma. Eli Lilly manufactured cannabis preparations under the trade name Succus Cannabis. The market was vast, the products were everywhere, and respectable Americans used them without shame or secrecy. These medicines were not snake oil sold by traveling charlatans, though plenty of that existed too. They were products of the emerging American pharmaceutical industry. Manufactured by companies like Park Davis, Eli Lilly, and Squibb, companies that still exist today as major players in the global drug market. Cannabis extracts, tinctures, and preparations were listed in the official United States Pharmacopoeia, the authoritative compendium of recognized medicines, from 1850 until 1942. For nearly a century, cannabis was not just legal in America, it was officially recognized as a legitimate, valuable medicine. On the frontier, far from doctors and hospitals, these patent medicines were often the only medical care available. A settler woman on an isolated homestead, days from the nearest town, kept a medicine chest stocked with the remedies she hoped would see her family through illness and injury. Cannabis preparations occupied a prominent place in that chest. They treated pain, from toothaches to broken bones to the chronic agonies of hard physical labor. They treated digestive complaints from dysentery to colic. They treated nervous conditions, the anxiety and depression that plagued people living in constant danger and uncertainty. They treated insomnia, allowing exhausted bodies to finally rest. They were, in short, the aspirin of their age, a versatile remedy that every household kept on hand. And then there were the uses that polite society preferred not to discuss. The frontier was especially hard on women. They worked alongside men in the fields and the mines. They bore children in circumstances that would terrify a modern obstetrician, often without any medical assistance at all. They suffered from conditions that were barely acknowledged in the medical literature of the time, lumped together under the vague category of female complaints. Cannabis was one of the few effective treatments available for these conditions. It eased the pain of menstruation, which could be debilitating for women engaged in hard physical labor. It helped with the symptoms of menopause, a transition that received almost no medical attention in an era focused on reproduction. Most importantly, it was used during childbirth. Frontier women giving birth without doctors or midwives, with only their husbands or neighbors to assist, turned to cannabis preparations to manage the pain of labor. Queen Victoria herself was prescribed cannabis by her personal physician for menstrual discomfort, lending the treatment an air of respectability that extended across the Atlantic. Picture a frontier cabin in the middle of a Wyoming winter. The nearest doctor is 50 miles away, and the snow has made travel impossible. A woman is in labor, her first child, and something is wrong. The contractions have been going on for hours, but the baby will not come. Her husband can do nothing but hold her hand and pray. But in the medicine chest there is a small brown bottle of cannabis tincture, purchased months ago from a traveling peddler. She takes a dose and then another. The pain does not disappear, but it recedes enough that she can breathe, can gather her strength, can push one more time. And finally, the baby comes, red-faced and screaming, healthy and whole. This scene played out countless times across the American frontier. Women and children survived because cannabis was there when nothing else was. The hidden medical history of frontier women is a history written in cannabis. The diaries and letters that have survived tell fragments of the story, references to nervine medicines and soothing preparations that, when investigated, turn out to have been cannabis-based. These women were not bohemians or radicals. They were church-going wives and mothers, the very foundation of respectable society, and they used cannabis as a matter of course because it worked, because it was available, and because no one had yet told them it was wrong. Hemp rope in the wagon traces, hemp rope on the cattle drive, hemp rope in the mine shaft, hemp rope on the railroad, hemp rope at the army post, hemp canvas on the wagon top, hemp canvas in the miner's pants, cannabis medicine in the general store, cannabis medicine in the medicine chest, cannabis medicine in the moment of greatest need. The Wild West was not just built with hemp and cannabis. It was saturated with them, dependent on them, inconceivable without them. This was not a fringe phenomenon. This was not a counterculture. This was the absolute mainstream of American frontier life. The cowboys and miners and soldiers and settlers who conquered the West and built the nation we know today were cannabis users. Every single one of them. They wore it on their bodies. They held it in their hands. They swallowed it when they were sick. They depended on it for their survival. Cannabis was as American as the frontier itself, woven into the fabric of national expansion as thoroughly as the stars and stripes. And then it was gone. Erased, forgotten, criminalized. The plant that had built the West became the plant that would destroy your life if you were caught with it. The medicine that had eased the suffering of countless frontier families became a Schedule I controlled substance, classified by the federal government as having no accepted medical use. The rope that had held together wagons and ranches and mines became contraband, illegal to grow, illegal to possess, illegal even to research. So what happened? How did America forget? How did a plant that had been mandatory to cultivate become felony to possess? How did a medicine that had been in every pharmacy become a drug that would send you to prison? How did the very material of the frontier, the fiber and the flower that had made westward expansion possible, become the most demonized substance in American history? The answer to those questions is not a story of science discovering danger. It is not a story of public health officials responding to a genuine threat. It is a story of racism, of greed, of political manipulation, and of lies told so effectively and so often that they became accepted as truth. It is a story of how a nation was made to forget its own history, to turn against a plant it had depended on for centuries, to imprison millions of its own citizens for possessing something their great-grandparents could have bought at any general store. That story is coming. But first, let us understand the world that was about to be destroyed. Let us understand what America lost when it declared war on cannabis. Because the Wild West was only the beginning. In the decades after the frontier closed, cannabis medicine would reach the peak of its mainstream acceptance, becoming one of the most widely used remedies in the American pharmacopoeia. And then suddenly, catastrophically, it would all come crashing down. The man who would bring cannabis into the modern Western medical establishment was not American. He was an Irish physician named William Brooke O'Shaughnessy, and in 1833, at the age of 24, he found himself stationed in Calcutta as an assistant surgeon with the British East India Company. India was the jewel of the British Empire, a land of unimaginable wealth and equally unimaginable suffering, and O'Shaughnessy threw himself into the study of its diseases with the fervour of a man determined to make his mark on history. But it was not disease that would make O'Shaughnessy famous. It was a plant that the Indians had been using for thousands of years, a plant that British colonial doctors had largely ignored or dismissed as native superstition. Cannabis. O'Shaughnessy approached it with the rigorous methodology of European science, conducting experiments on animals and then on human patients, carefully documenting his observations, building a body of evidence that could not be dismissed. In 1839, he published his findings in the Provincial Medical Journal, and the paper electrified the medical world. O'Shaughnessy reported that cannabis was remarkably effective for a range of conditions that had frustrated Western physicians. It relieved the terrible muscle spasms of tetanus, a disease that was almost always fatal and for which there was no effective treatment. It calmed the convulsions of rabies, buying patients precious time. It eased the symptoms of cholera, the great scourge of colonial India. It reduced pain without the dangerous side effects of opium. And unlike so many treatments of the era, which were based on tradition and superstition rather than observation, O'Shaughnessy's conclusions were grounded in systematic research. He had tested cannabis scientifically, and the results were undeniable. When O'Shaughnessy returned to England in the 1840s, he brought cannabis with him. He brought samples of the plant, extracts and tinctures prepared according to Indian methods, and most importantly, he brought credibility. He was not a mystic or a quack. He was a respected physician with impeccable credentials, and when he advocated for the medical use of cannabis, the British medical establishment listened. Within years, cannabis preparations were being prescribed across England for conditions ranging from migraines to menstrual cramps to the agonies of childbirth. The plant that had been dismissed as an exotic curiosity became a staple of the Victorian medicine cabinet. The United States was not far behind. In 1850, cannabis was officially added to the United States Pharmacopoeia, the authoritative compendium that listed all medicines recognized by the American medical establishment. This was not a minor administrative notation. The Pharmacopoeia was the gold standard, the official arbiter of what counted as legitimate medicine and what did not. Inclusion meant that cannabis had been reviewed by the leading medical authorities of the day, that its therapeutic value had been acknowledged by the profession, that doctors could prescribe it and pharmacists could dispense it with the full blessing of medical science. And dispense it they did. In the decades following the Pharmacopoeia listing, cannabis became one of the most widely used medicines in America. It was prescribed for an extraordinary range of conditions: migraines and headaches, menstrual cramps and the pains of childbirth, insomnia and nervous exhaustion, muscle spasms and convulsions, neuralgia, that catch-all term for nerve pain that plagued so many in an era before modern painkillers, asthma and bronchitis, loss of appetite and digestive complaints, depression and hysteria. The list went on, and for many of these conditions, cannabis was among the most effective treatments available. The pharmaceutical companies of the era embraced cannabis with enthusiasm. Parke-Davis, one of the largest drug manufacturers in the country, produced a full line of cannabis products, including tinctures, extracts, and compressed tablets. Their catalogue offered cannabis indica in multiple strengths and formulations suitable for different conditions and different patients. Eli Lilly manufactured cannabis preparations under several trade names, marketing them to physicians and pharmacists as reliable, standardized medications. Squibb, Bristol-Myers, and dozens of smaller manufacturers competed for market share in what had become a lucrative and entirely respectable business. The advertising for these products was frank, straightforward, and completely unremarkable. Open any medical journal from the 1880s or 1890s and you would find advertisements for cannabis preparations alongside ads for quinine and aspirin and all the other medicines of the day. The language was matter of fact, emphasizing quality and consistency and therapeutic efficacy. There was no hint of danger, no suggestion of moral hazard, no warning that this substance might be anything other than what it appeared to be, a useful medicine for common ailments. A bottle of cannabis tincture might cost 25 or 30 cents at your local pharmacy, roughly equivalent to $5 or $6 today. It required no prescription. You simply walked in, asked the pharmacist for what you needed, paid your money, and walked out. No stigma, no fear, no suspicious looks or whispered conversations. Cannabis was as normal as cough syrup, as unremarkable as headache powder, as accepted as any other item on the pharmacy shelf. Millions of Americans used it, from farmers to factory workers to society matrons, and no one thought twice about it. The medical literature of the period treated cannabis with the same sober professionalism applied to any other therapeutic agent. Physicians wrote detailed case studies describing successful treatments. Researchers investigated the pharmacology of the plant, trying to understand how it produced its effects. Debates occurred about dosing and formulation and the relative merits of different cannabis varieties. The same debates that occurred about every medicine. Cannabis was part of the mainstream medical conversation, discussed in the same journals and conferences where the great advances of 19th century medicine were announced. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, cannabis was making a rather different kind of impression on European culture. In Paris, during the 1840s, a group of writers and artists formed a club dedicated to exploring the effects of hashish, the concentrated resin of the cannabis plant. They called themselves the Club des Hachishans, and their membership read like a roster of French literary genius. Charles Baudelaire was a regular attendee. Alexandre Dumas, author of The Three Musketeers, participated in the sessions. Victor Hugo, Honoré de Balzac, Gérard de Nerval, and other luminaries of the French Romantic movement all experimented with the substance under the club's auspices. The club would meet at the Hôtel de Lauzun on the Île Saint-Louis, a small island in the heart of Paris. There, in ornate rooms filled with oriental carpets and exotic decorations, they would consume dawamesque, a thick green paste of cannabis mixed with honey, pistachios, and aromatic spices. The effects were profound, sometimes euphoric, sometimes terrifying, always transformative. Baudelaire wrote extensively about his experiences, describing the way hashish distorted time, amplified sensations, and unlocked hidden chambers of the imagination. His essay, Le Paradis Artificiels, remains one of the classic accounts of drug-induced altered states. But even Baudelaire, who celebrated the visionary potential of hashish, warned of its dangers. He wrote of the way it could seduce the user into a passive, dreamlike state that sapped the will and undermined the creative drive. The paradise it offered was artificial, a counterfeit of the genuine transcendence that could only be achieved through art and spiritual discipline. The Club des Hachishis was not an endorsement of cannabis use. It was an exploration, an experiment, an attempt by some of the most brilliant minds of the age to understand what this ancient substance could reveal about the human psyche. In America, this bohemian experimentation remained largely unknown. Cannabis was medicine, not mysticism. It was found in pharmacies, not salons. The farmers and housewives who took their evening dose of cannabis tincture for insomnia or nervousness had no interest in exploring altered states of consciousness. They simply wanted relief from their symptoms, and cannabis provided it. The gap between the French literary avant-garde and the American medical mainstream could not have been wider, yet both were using the same plant, drawing on the same ancient pharmacology, participating in the same global commerce in cannabis products. By the turn of the 20th century, cannabis had reached the peak of its mainstream acceptance in America. It was listed in the Pharmacopoeia. It was manufactured by the most respected pharmaceutical companies. It was prescribed by physicians and dispensed by pharmacists, and used by patients from every walk of life. It was advertised in medical journals and sold in general stores and kept in medicine cabinets from Maine to California. There was no war on cannabis. There was no Drug Enforcement Administration. There were no mandatory minimum sentences or no-knock raids or civil asset forfeiture. There was simply a plant, ancient and useful, integrated into the fabric of American medical practice, as it had been integrated into the medical practices of civilizations around the world for thousands of years. No prescription needed, no stigma, no fear. Americans of that generation could not have imagined a world in which possessing cannabis would be a crime. The very idea would have seemed absurd, like criminalizing aspirin or outlawing coffee. The plant was too useful, too ubiquitous, too deeply embedded in the normal commerce of everyday life. The pharmaceutical companies had too much invested in it. The physicians relied on it too heavily. The patients benefited from it too obviously. How could anyone seriously propose banning a medicine that had been used safely and effectively for millennia? But everything was about to change, not because scientists discovered some hidden danger in the plant, not because doctors observed harmful effects they had previously missed, not because the pharmaceutical companies found their products were hurting patients. None of that happened. The medicine that had served humanity for 10,000 years did not suddenly become poisonous in the early 20th century. What changed was who was using it, or rather, what changed was who was seen to be using it, because cannabis had another life in America, a life that existed parallel to the respectable world of pharmacies and physicians, a life that the mainstream had largely ignored until circumstances made it impossible to ignore any longer. In the border towns of Texas and the jazz clubs of New Orleans, in the barrios of Los Angeles and the ghettos of Chicago, people were using cannabis in a different way. They were not taking measured doses of pharmaceutical tincture for their migraines. They were smoking it. They were smoking it for pleasure, for relaxation, for the altered state of consciousness that the Club des Hashishis had explored in their Parisian salon. And the people who were smoking it, the people who were becoming visible as cannabis users in the public imagination, were not white middle-class Americans buying medicine at the pharmacy. They were Mexican immigrants fleeing revolution and poverty. They were black jazz musicians playing music that respectable society found threatening. They were outsiders, minorities, people who existed on the margins of American life and who could be safely demonized without political consequence. The plant had not changed. The medicine was the same medicine it had always been, but the story was about to change, and with it, everything else. A campaign was coming, a campaign built on racism and lies, on propaganda and political opportunism, on fears that had nothing to do with pharmacology and everything to do with power. The same plant that had been required by colonial law, that had been grown by the founding fathers, that had been listed in the Pharmacopoeia and manufactured by Eli Lilly and sold in every pharmacy in America, was about to become public enemy number one. Everything was about to change, not because of the plant, because of who was smoking it. A.C. Fay, The Conspiracy Minutes, 80 to 100, 2,500 words. In 1910, Mexico erupted. The revolution that would tear the country apart for the next decade sent waves of refugees streaming north across the border into Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and California. They were fleeing violence and chaos, seeking safety and opportunity in a nation that had always promised both to those willing to work for them. They brought with them their language, their culture, their Catholic faith, their music, their food, and they brought with them a custom that most Americans had never encountered. They smoked marijuana. The word itself was foreign, Spanish, unfamiliar to English-speaking Americans who had been using cannabis medicines for decades without ever hearing it called by that name. Marijuana, marijuana. The spelling varied, but the effect was the same. It sounded exotic, dangerous, alien. It sounded like something that did not belong in America, something that had been smuggled across the border along with the refugees themselves. And this was no accident. This was strategy. The Americans who wanted to ban cannabis understood something crucial about the psychology of fear. If they had proposed outlawing cannabis, the medicine that sat in millions of American medicine cabinets, they would have faced immediate opposition. Doctors would have objected. Pharmaceutical companies would have lobbied against it. Ordinary citizens would have wondered why the government was trying to take away their headache remedy. But marijuana, that was different. Marijuana was what the Mexicans smoked. Marijuana was foreign and frightening. Marijuana could be banned without anyone realizing they were banning the same plant that Eli Lilly manufactured and Park Davis sold, and the United States Pharmacopoeia had listed for over half a century. The deliberate foreignization of cannabis was one of the most effective propaganda techniques in American history. By using the Mexican Spanish word instead of the familiar English or Latin terms, opponents could make the plant seem like an invasion, something brought by outsiders to corrupt American society. Cannabis was medicine. Marijuana was a Mexican drug. The distinction was entirely artificial, but it worked. It worked because it tapped into the deep vein of racism and xenophobia that ran through American culture. The fear of the foreign, the suspicion of the immigrant, the belief that the nation was under threat from people who did not look or speak or worship like real Americans. The newspapers of the Southwest were eager accomplices in this campaign. In Texas, in particular, where Mexican immigration was heaviest and where Anglo-anxiety about demographic change was most acute, local papers ran a steady stream of sensationalized stories about marijuana and the Mexicans who used it. The headlines screamed of marijuana-crazed Mexicans committing acts of violence that defied belief. Men driven to murder by a single puff of the demon weed, women violated, children endangered. Every fear that white Texans harbored about their Mexican neighbors was projected onto this convenient scapegoat, this foreign drug that could be blamed for every crime, every social ill, every threat to the established order. In 1914, El Paso became one of the first cities in the United States to ban marijuana. The motivation was transparent to anyone who cared to look. The city council was not responding to a public health crisis. There was no epidemic of marijuana-related illness or death. They were responding to the presence of Mexican immigrants in their city, and they wanted a tool to control them. By criminalizing marijuana, they gave the police a pretext to arrest, harass, and deport Mexicans who had committed no other offense. The drug law was a weapon of racial control dressed up in the language of public safety. But it was not only Mexicans who smoked marijuana in early 20th century America. As the Great Migration brought millions of Black Americans from the rural South to the industrial cities of the North, they brought their culture with them, and that culture included jazz, a new kind of music that was emerging from the streets and clubs of New Orleans. A music of improvisation and syncopation, of wild rhythms and wilder energy. Jazz was revolutionary, and like all revolutionary art, it terrified the establishment. In the smoky basement clubs of Harlem and Chicago and Kansas City, jazz musicians discovered that marijuana enhanced their art. It slowed time, sharpened perception, allowed improvisational flights that seemed to transcend ordinary consciousness. Louis Armstrong was a lifelong devotee, referring to marijuana as gauge and crediting it with relaxing him and making his music flow. Cab Calloway sang about it in his 1932 hit Reefer Man, a playful, coded celebration of cannabis culture that delighted audiences who understood the reference. For the musicians of the jazz age, marijuana was not a dangerous drug. It was a tool of their trade, as essential as their instruments. But what the black jazz community celebrated, white America viewed with horror. Jazz itself was considered dangerous, primitive, sexually provocative, a corruption of civilized musical standards. And the marijuana that fueled it became tarred with the same brush. Now the drug was associated not only with Mexicans, but with black people, with jazz, with everything that respectable white society feared and despised. The propaganda shifted accordingly. Marijuana was not just a Mexican problem, it was a Negro problem. It was the drug of the dangerous classes, the outsiders, the people who threatened white supremacy simply by existing. Into this volatile mixture of racism and fear stepped a man who would shape American drug policy for the next 3 decades. His name was Harry Jacob Anslinger, and in 1930 he was appointed the first commissioner of the newly created Federal Bureau of Narcotics. Anslinger was a bureaucrat with ambition, a moralist with a megaphone, and a racist with power. He would become the most effective drug warrior in American history, and his legacy would destroy millions of lives. In his early years at the Bureau, Anslinger had paid little attention to marijuana. His focus was on opiates and cocaine, the drugs that had been federally regulated since the Harrison Act of 1914. But as the Great Depression deepened and government budgets tightened, Anslinger needed a new crusade to justify his agency's existence and his own position. Marijuana, which was still largely unregulated at the federal level, presented the perfect opportunity. Here was a drug associated with despised minorities, already demonized in local newspapers, ripe for a national campaign that could make Anslinger famous and his bureau indispensable. Anslinger launched a propaganda offensive that was as relentless as it was dishonest. He cultivated relationships with newspaper editors across the country, feeding them a steady diet of horror stories about marijuana and its effects. He testified before Congress, with tales of violence and insanity that would have been laughable if they had not been so effective. And he was not subtle about the racial dimension of his campaign. In private correspondence and public testimony, Anslinger made his views horrifyingly clear. He spoke of reefer making darkies think they are as good as white men. He warned that marijuana caused white women to seek sexual relations with Negroes, entertainers, and any others. His racism was not incidental to his crusade, it was central to it. Anslinger maintained what he called a gore file, a collection of lurid stories about marijuana-related crimes that he would deploy whenever he needed to shock a congressional committee or terrify a newspaper editor. The stories were sensational, gruesome, and almost entirely fabricated. His favorite case, the one he cited more than any other, was the story of Victor Licata. In October 1933, in Tampa, Florida, a 21-year-old man named Victor Licata murdered his parents, 2 brothers, and a sister with an axe. It was a horrific crime, the kind that captures headlines and haunts nightmares, and Anslinger seized upon it immediately, declaring that Licata had been driven to his murderous rampage by marijuana. The case became Exhibit A in the campaign against cannabis, cited in congressional testimony, repeated in newspaper articles, used to justify ever harsher laws and penalties. There was only one problem. It was not true. Victor Licata had a long and well-documented history of severe mental illness. He had been diagnosed with dementia praecox, what we would now call schizophrenia, years before the murders. His family had resisted efforts to have him committed to a psychiatric institution. There was no evidence whatsoever that he had used marijuana before the crime. The psychiatrists who examined him made no mention of drug use in their reports. Anslinger's claim was a lie, pure and simple, told to advance a political agenda and repeated so often that it became accepted as truth. Hollywood joined the campaign with enthusiasm. In 1936, a propaganda film was released that would become the definitive document of marijuana hysteria. Originally titled Tell Your Children, it was later renamed Reefer Madness, and it depicted marijuana use as a one-way ticket to insanity, violence, and death. The film followed clean-cut teenagers who were lured to a marijuana party and within minutes descended into hallucination, hysteria, murder, and suicide. One character plays piano with manic intensity before collapsing. Another runs over a pedestrian and laughs about it. A young woman is sexually assaulted. A young man shoots someone during a marijuana-induced psychotic break. The film was absurd, over the top, disconnected from any reality that actual marijuana users would recognize. Anyone who had ever smoked cannabis knew that it did not produce the effects depicted on screen, but Reefer Madness was not made for cannabis users. It was made for their parents, for school boards, for church groups, for all the respectable Americans who had never used the drug and had no way of knowing how wildly the film exaggerated its dangers. It was distributed to schools and churches as an educational tool, shown to millions of Americans who came away convinced that marijuana was a menace that had to be stopped. By 1937, Anslinger had built enough political momentum to push for federal legislation. The result was the Marijuana Tax Act, a masterpiece of bureaucratic prohibition. The law did not technically criminalize marijuana. Instead, it imposed such onerous taxes and regulatory requirements that legal compliance became virtually impossible. Anyone who wanted to cultivate, prescribe, or sell cannabis had to register with the federal government, pay exorbitant fees, fill out complex paperwork, and obtain tax stamps that were never actually made available. It was prohibition disguised as regulation, a ban hidden behind a maze of red tape. The American Medical Association sent a representative to testify against the bill. Dr. William Woodward pointed out that cannabis had legitimate medical uses, that there was no scientific evidence supporting the wild claims of violence and insanity, and that the term marijuana was being deliberately used to obscure the fact that Congress was voting to ban a recognized medicine. His testimony was ignored. When he finished speaking, one congressman responded with contempt, asking if the AMA had any constructive suggestions rather than criticism. The medical establishment had been heard and dismissed. The pharmaceutical companies, caught off guard by the speed of the legislative process, barely had time to register their objections. The law passed with minimal debate and almost no opposition. Some historians have argued that corporate interests played a role in the prohibition of cannabis. Beyond the obvious racism that drove the public campaign, the DuPont Chemical Company had recently patented nylon, a synthetic fiber that would compete directly with hemp in the rope and textile markets. William Randolph Hearst, the newspaper magnate whose papers had been among the most enthusiastic promoters of marijuana hysteria, owned vast timber holdings that supplied his paper mills, and hemp paper represented a potential threat to that business. The decorticator, a new machine that promised to make hemp processing far more efficient and economical, had recently been featured on the cover of Popular Mechanics under the headline New Billion-Dollar Crop. The theory is tantalizing, and it fits neatly into a narrative of corporate conspiracy against a competing natural product. But the evidence is circumstantial. We cannot prove that DuPont or Hearst actively lobbied for marijuana prohibition, or that their business interests drove the legislation. What we can prove is that prohibition was built on a foundation of racism and lies, that the scientific and medical objections were ignored, and that the result served the interests of those who wanted to eliminate hemp as a competitor. Whether this was conspiracy or coincidence, the effect was the same. Industrial hemp, which had been legal and mandatory and celebrated for 3 centuries, was banned alongside marijuana, swept up in a prohibition that made no distinction between the rope plant and the drug plant. And then came the war. In December 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor and brought the United States into World War II. Suddenly, the nation faced a crisis. Japanese forces quickly overran the Philippines and cut off America's supply of Manila hemp, the fiber used for naval rope and rigging. The military needed hemp, needed it desperately, needed it now, and the only source was the plant that the government had just spent years demonizing and criminalizing. The reversal was instantaneous and shameless. In 1942, the United States Department of Agriculture produced a propaganda film called Hemp for Victory, urging American farmers to plant hemp as their patriotic duty. The same government that had told Americans that hemp was a dangerous drug was now telling them it was essential to the war effort. Farmers who grew hemp were exempted from military service. Over 400,000 acres of hemp were planted across the Midwest. The plant that had been banned in 1937 was being subsidized and celebrated in 1942. The hypocrisy was staggering, but it revealed a truth that the prohibitionists would have preferred to keep hidden. Hemp was not dangerous. It was useful. It always had been. The ban had never been about protecting public health or preventing drug abuse. It had been about racism, about control, about eliminating economic competition. And when national security required hemp, all those concerns evaporated overnight. The demon weed became the patriot plant, and everyone was expected to pretend that nothing had changed. But the moment the war ended, the tolerance ended with it. The hemp fields were ploughed under. The Hemp for Victory film was buried so thoroughly that for decades the government denied it had ever existed, until researchers unearthed copies in the Library of Congress. The prohibition resumed as if it had never been interrupted, and this time it would intensify, expand, and eventually become the most destructive social policy in American history. Decades later, in 1994, a former Nixon administration official named John Ehrlichman would finally say out loud what insiders had always known. The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had 2 enemies, Ehrlichman admitted in an interview: the anti-war left and black people. We knew we could not make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. Of course we did. There it was, finally, from someone who had been in the room. The drug war was never about drugs. It was about power. It was about control. It was about using the criminal justice system to suppress dissent and target minorities. The lies that Harry Anslinger told in the 1930s were still being told in the 1970s, and they would continue to be told for decades after that, because the lies worked, because they achieved their purpose, because they gave the government a weapon it could use against anyone it wanted to destroy. And so the erasure was complete. The plant that had been mandatory in colonial Virginia, that had been grown by George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, that had clothed the frontier and healed the sick and held together the wagons that built the West, was buried. Its history was forgotten. Its name was changed. Its users were demonized and imprisoned. A century of medicine was wiped from the record. An agricultural tradition stretching back to the founding of the nation was criminalized overnight. The plant that built the West was buried, and in its place rose a war. The 1960s brought cannabis back into the American mainstream, though not in the way its advocates had hoped. The counterculture that erupted on college campuses and in urban centers across the country embraced marijuana as a symbol of rebellion, a rejection of everything their parents' generation represented. The hippies in San Francisco's Haight-Ashbury, the protesters at the Democratic Convention in Chicago, the crowds at Woodstock, they were united by music, by idealism, and by marijuana. To smoke it was to declare yourself against the Vietnam War, against racism, against the conformity of 1950s America. The establishment was horrified. These were not Mexican laborers or black jazz musicians who could be dismissed and ignored. These were white, middle-class kids, the sons and daughters of respectable families, and they were lighting up by the millions. Richard Nixon saw opportunity in their parents' terror. Running for president in 1968, he made law and order the centerpiece of his campaign, and drug enforcement was at the heart of that message. When he won, he moved quickly to transform American drug policy. In 1970, Nixon signed the Controlled Substances Act, creating a new framework for classifying and regulating drugs. The law established 5 schedules, ranked by medical value and potential for abuse. Marijuana was placed in Schedule 1, the most restrictive category, defined as having a high potential for abuse and no currently accepted medical use. It was classified alongside heroin and LSD and above cocaine and methamphetamine, which were placed in Schedule 2. This classification was not based on science. Nixon himself had appointed a commission headed by former Pennsylvania Governor Raymond Schaefer to study marijuana and make recommendations for policy. The Schaefer Commission spent 2 years conducting the most comprehensive review of cannabis ever undertaken by the federal government. In 1972, they delivered their conclusions. Marijuana, they found, did not cause the violence and insanity that had been claimed for decades. It was not a gateway to harder drugs. Its dangers had been grossly exaggerated. The commission recommended that personal possession be decriminalized. Nixon buried the report. He ignored its findings completely, refused to implement any of its recommendations, and continued to escalate the war on marijuana as if the commission had never existed. The machinery of enforcement expanded relentlessly. The Drug Enforcement Administration was created in 1973, consolidating federal drug enforcement powers under a single agency with vast resources and authority. State and local police departments received federal funding and military equipment to fight the drug war. Mandatory minimum sentences were introduced, stripping judges of discretion and ensuring that even minor marijuana offences could result in years behind bars. The arrests began in earnest, and they never stopped. 26 million. That is the number of Americans arrested for marijuana offences between 1965 and 2020. 26 million people processed through the criminal justice system for possessing a plant that their great-grandparents could have bought at any pharmacy. That is more than the entire population of Australia, more than the population of Texas. If everyone ever arrested for marijuana in America formed their own country, it would be larger than most nations on Earth. One arrest every 90 seconds. That was the pace at the height of the drug war. Every minute and a half, somewhere in America, someone was being handcuffed, searched, photographed, fingerprinted, and processed into the system for marijuana. Most of them, approximately 88%, were arrested for simple possession, not dealing, not trafficking, not running criminal enterprises, just possession. Just having a small amount of a plant for their own personal use. One arrest every 90 seconds around the clock, year after year, decade after decade. And here is where the ghost of Harry Anslinger still haunts American justice. The enforcement of marijuana laws has never been race neutral. It was designed from the beginning to target minorities, and it has done so with ruthless efficiency. Study after study has confirmed what anyone paying attention already knew. Black Americans and white Americans use marijuana at roughly the same rates. The data is consistent across decades of research. There is no significant difference in cannabis consumption between racial groups. But Black Americans are nearly 4 times more likely to be arrested for marijuana possession than white Americans. In some states, the disparity is even more extreme. In Montana, black people are nearly 10 times more likely to be arrested for marijuana than white people, despite making up less than 1% of the state's population. In Iowa, the ratio is over 7 to 1. In the District of Columbia, the nation's capital, black residents are arrested for marijuana at 8 times the rate of white residents. Equal usage, wildly unequal enforcement. This is not a bug in the system. This is the system working exactly as it was designed. The arrest is only the beginning. The real punishment for a marijuana conviction extends far beyond any jail sentence, reaching into every corner of a person's life for years, often for a lifetime. A criminal record follows you. It appears on every job application, every housing application, every background check. Employers see it and move on to the next candidate. Landlords see it and reject your application. The doors that should be open to every American citizen slam shut, one after another. A marijuana conviction can mean ineligibility for federal student loans, cutting off the path to higher education that is one of the few reliable routes out of poverty. It can mean exclusion from public housing, forcing families onto the street or into overcrowded, substandard apartments. It can mean loss of food stamps at the very moment when a family needs them most. It can mean the revocation of professional licenses, destroying careers that took years to build. In many states, it means the loss of the right to vote, the most fundamental expression of citizenship, sometimes permanently. And then there are the families, the children who grew up visiting their parents in prison, who learned to associate love with metal detectors and supervised visitation rooms, the marriages that collapsed under the strain of separation and stigma, the parents who missed first steps and graduations and weddings because they were locked in a cell for possessing a plant, the web of relationships torn apart by enforcement of a law that was never about public safety and always about control. But the destruction did not stop at the American border. By keeping marijuana illegal, the United States guaranteed that the enormous demand for cannabis would be met by criminal organizations operating outside the law. The Mexican cartels, which had grown rich and powerful from the cocaine trade, expanded enthusiastically into marijuana. They planted vast fields in the mountains of the Sierra Madre, thousands of acres cultivated by workers who were often themselves victims of cartel violence. They built smuggling networks that moved tons of product across the border every year, and they fought each other for control of the trade with a savagery that defies comprehension. 300,000, that is the estimated number of people killed in Mexico's drug war since 2006. 300,000 human beings murdered in a conflict that exists only because drugs are illegal and therefore profitable. The violence is apocalyptic. Entire towns have been depopulated. Mass graves dot the landscape, filled with the bodies of people who were in the wrong place at the wrong time, or who defied the wrong cartel, or who simply had something that someone more powerful wanted. Journalists who reported on the cartels have been assassinated. Politicians who opposed them have been gunned down in broad daylight. The Mexican state itself has been hollowed out by corruption and violence, its sovereignty compromised, its citizens living in fear. And a significant portion of this carnage, this ocean of blood, was spilled over marijuana. Not all of it, certainly. The cartels deal in cocaine, heroin, methamphetamine, fentanyl. But marijuana was part of the portfolio, part of the profit stream, part of the reason the cartels became so powerful that they could challenge the government itself. American prohibition created the market, American consumers provided the demand, and Mexican citizens paid the price in blood. And what did all of this accomplish? What did the arrests and the imprisonments and the broken families and the cartel wars actually achieve? The answer is nothing. Absolutely nothing. The stated goal of marijuana prohibition was to reduce use, to protect public health, to prevent Americans from consuming a dangerous substance. By every measure, prohibition failed completely. Usage rates did not decline, they increased. When the modern drug war began in the early 1970s, approximately 12% of Americans reported having used marijuana at least once. Today, that number is closer to 50%. Half the country has tried a substance that the government classified as having no medical use and a high potential for abuse. The enforcement apparatus, the billions of dollars, the millions of arrests, the thousands of lives destroyed, none of it made any difference to whether Americans used marijuana. It only determined what happened to them if they got caught. Prohibition did not eliminate marijuana. It handed the entire market to criminals. It filled prisons with non-violent offenders. It destroyed communities and families. It fueled cartel empires and cost hundreds of thousands of lives. It created problems that would not have existed if the plant had simply remained legal as it had been for all of human history. The war on marijuana was not just a failure. It was a catastrophe, a self-inflicted wound that America has spent half a century bleeding from. And still, even now, the arrests continue. The lives continue to be ruined. The war continues to be fought, long after everyone with eyes to see has recognized that it cannot be won and was never worth fighting in the first place. The crack in the wall came from an unexpected place. In the 1980s, as the AIDS epidemic devastated the gay community, particularly in San Francisco, patients discovered what their great-grandparents had known. Cannabis helped. It stimulated appetite in people wasting away from the disease. It eased the nausea caused by the brutal early medications. It offered comfort when comfort was scarce. A man named Dennis Peron, himself HIV positive, opened the San Francisco Cannabis Buyers Club in 1992, the first public dispensary in the nation, operating openly in defiance of federal law. He provided marijuana to dying people, and the local authorities, recognizing the humanitarian stakes, largely left him alone. Peron and his allies drafted Proposition 215, the Compassionate Use Act, and placed it on the California ballot in 1996. The federal government warned of consequences. The drug warriors predicted disaster. But on election night, 56% of California voters said yes. Medical marijuana was legal in the nation's largest state. The dam had cracked. Oregon and Washington followed, then Alaska, then Maine. By 2010, 15 states had medical marijuana laws. By 2020, that number had grown to 36, plus the District of Columbia. The plant that the government had classified as having no medical use was being prescribed by doctors across the country for exactly the conditions it had been used to treat a century before. The next step came in 2012, when voters in Colorado and Washington approved ballot measures to legalize recreational marijuana for adults. It was an historic moment, the first time any jurisdiction in the world had fully legalized cannabis through democratic vote. The federal government held its breath, uncertain how to respond to states openly defying national drug policy. The Obama administration chose accommodation, issuing guidelines that allowed state legalization to proceed as long as certain conditions were met. The floodgates opened. Alaska, Oregon, California, Nevada, Massachusetts. The cascade continued, state after state choosing to end the war within their borders. But legalization has not resolved the contradictions at the heart of American cannabis policy. It has only made them more visible. Marijuana remains a Schedule I controlled substance under federal law, classified as having no accepted medical use, even as doctors in most states prescribe it and dispensaries operate in gleaming storefronts. This federal illegality creates bizarre consequences. Cannabis businesses, even those operating entirely within state law, cannot access the banking system. They deal in cash, enormous amounts of it, making them targets for robbery and creating nightmares of logistics and accounting. The IRS punishes them with Section 280E of the tax code, which prohibits businesses trafficking in controlled substances from deducting normal operating expenses, resulting in effective tax rates that can exceed 70%. And then there is the question that haunts the entire legalization movement. Who benefits? The legal cannabis industry is projected to generate tens of billions of dollars in the coming years, but the people getting rich are not, by and large, the people who suffered under Prohibition. The executives and investors who are building cannabis empires are overwhelmingly white. The communities that were devastated by decades of targeted enforcement remain largely shut out of the legal market. The barriers to entry are enormous, requiring capital and connections that those communities do not have. Some states have created social equity programs, promising priority licensing to people from neighborhoods disproportionately harmed by the drug war. But these programs have been plagued by underfunding, bureaucratic delays, and outright exploitation by wealthy applicants using minority partners as fronts. Meanwhile, in states that have not legalized, the war continues. People are still being arrested for marijuana possession in Texas and Tennessee and Georgia and Alabama. People are still serving prison sentences for offenses that are legal a few hundred miles away. The criminal justice system that was built to enforce prohibition has not been dismantled. It has merely been redirected, concentrating its force on the states where legalization has not yet arrived, on the communities that have always borne the brunt of enforcement. The work of justice is not finished. It has barely begun. But in the fields of Kentucky, where hemp once grew by colonial mandate, something quiet is happening. Industrial hemp is coming back. The 2018 Farm Bill removed hemp from the Controlled Substances Act, legalizing its cultivation for the first time in decades. Farmers across the heartland are planting it again, the same varieties that their great-great-grandfathers grew. The low THC fiber crop that has nothing to do with intoxication and everything to do with utility. In Colorado, where recreational marijuana is legal and dispensaries dot the landscape, hemp fields stretch toward the mountains. The plant that built the covered wagons is being cultivated once more in the shadow of the Rockies. The circle is closing, slowly, imperfectly, with much work still to be done. The lies that Harry Anslinger told are finally being recognized as lies. The science that was suppressed is being rediscovered. The medicine that was taken away is being given back. The rope plant that was criminalized along with its psychoactive cousin is being welcomed home. America is remembering what it was made to forget. The sun sets over the high plains, painting the sky in shades of amber and gold, the same colours that greeted the wagon trains pushing west 150 years ago. In the distance, the mountains rise, eternal and indifferent to the dramas of human history. The wind moves through fields of hemp, rustling the serrated leaves, carrying the faint green scent of a plant that has been humanity's companion since before we learned to write. It was here before the prohibition and the propaganda, before the arrests and the imprisonments, before the lies and the violence. It will be here long after we are gone. This is not a story with a triumphant ending. Too much damage has been done for triumph. Too many lives have been destroyed. Too many families broken. Too many years stolen from people who committed no real crime. The debt that America owes to those it persecuted in the name of marijuana, prohibition can never fully be repaid. The best we can do is remember. Remember the history that was erased. Remember the plant that built the frontier. Remember the people who suffered so that others could profit from their suffering. The cowboys who coiled their hemp lariats at dusk are long gone. The settlers who crossed the plains under hemp canvas have passed into history. The mothers who eased their children's fevers with cannabis tincture are remembered only in faded photographs. But the plant remains, patient and resilient. It has waited through a century of persecution for humanity to remember what it always knew, that this is not a demon to be feared. It is a gift to be used wisely. It is a thread connecting us to our ancestors, to the deep past, to the 10,000 years of partnership that came before the madness of prohibition. The plant that built the Wild West was never really gone. It was only waiting for us to remember, waiting for us to come home.